Well, here we got an example of a very early Royal Enfield Bullet 350 G2 crankshaft from a very early engine. So early, I've never seen one like this before actually, and I had to check up on it. That the timing pinion and the worm drive for the oil pump spindle are actually all integral in one piece with the timing side main shaft. So it's the first time for everything. This is the first one of these I've ever seen. Anyway, I've got the engine stripped down to check it out, and it looks as if someone had actually been rebuilding it at some time, because I've got the crankcases split here and everything's quite clean inside. There's obviously been newly applied sealant around the joint pieces, but there's a bit of an unknown quantity, so it was decided that it should be stripped anyway, so here we are with it. And I just thought I'd spin the crank between centres as I usually do and just see what we've got. Now, even though I can't move this clock from side to side too easily, I wouldn't have been able to use that facility if I had it, because this main shaft is scrolled for oilways, and so the only place I can pick up a reading from is where it's at now, which is okay. It's a fairly sort of close point to where it actually doesn't run in a bearing, it just has a bronze bush this side, so it's very close to where it runs in a bush. And this one I will be moving from side to side, and what's interesting about this is if we spin it, we see that the rise and fall happens at the same time on one clock and the other, so effectively you'd say that one lot have run out, cancelled out the other. But as I move closer towards this flywheel, you can see that the amount of run out increases. Right, and I'll move it over again in a moment and we'll see it increase even more. So the closer that gauge is to the flywheel, the more the run out. So obviously the ends of the shafts are being held true in the centres, but there's fluctuation on the shafts as they move away from the centres towards the flywheels. And whether the camera will pick this up or not, you can actually see, or I can see, the entire flywheel assembly moving up and down as it rotates, and one flywheel more so than the other. On top of that, notice I can make the shank of the conrod rub on either flywheel, so I think it's going to be a pretty good idea, even though the big end feels okay, to separate these flywheels and take a look in there and see what's going on altogether, because that's not really too healthy a crank assembly in the state it's in. So I'll probably split that and take a look at it and see what we've got and see if I can improve on that. I'm pretty sure I will be able to, so that'll be my next job, get the flywheels apart and have a look in there. Well, with my keen assistant Millie, who seems to be snoozing on the job, we've got this crank assembly from the very early 350 model G2 Bullet engine all split now, and it is a very early one. It's got the timing side main shaft is integral with the timing pinion and the worm drive for the oil pump. It's all one piece. We've got it split. The big end felt okay. We've already spun it between centres in the lathe, but the shank of the conrod was rubbing on the inside faces of the flywheels. And I've been looking at it a bit more closely and I can see why. The early bullets up until about 1955, the 350s, had an overall narrower crankcase, and in the crank assemblies they ran this type of slightly narrower connecting rod to what the later types ran. In fact, I've got one of each type here. Let's see if we can compare them. If I hold them like that, we should see that that one is narrower than that one. Not by a huge amount, but certainly a couple of millimetres at least. The later types are a good bit wider, and obviously made that way in an attempt to make them stronger. But what someone's done here is this crank would have had obviously the early narrow type conrod like I've got in my hand. Somebody has decided that they'd use a wide one, and in order to fit it in there they've obviously taken a grinder to it to narrow it down, even at the big end eye, because the stance of the big end, the width of the big end is also wider in the later type conrods. So they ground the whole lot down. You can see where the material's gone from the side of the conrod there compared to what it would have looked like on this one. But unfortunately it's still been rubbing on the flywheels, as you can see by that sort of aluminium powder that's sort of mixed in with the sort of oily, greasy deposits. So even though there's no play in the big end, I think I'd best get this apart and have a look. But there's another problem. The thrust washer on the crank pin there just will not move. It's obviously too tight and for a different type, and it's been forced onto the crank pin so tightly I might have to even cut it off. I've tried a pair of tyre levers carefully underneath the conrod at either side like that, but I mean, you don't want to be too rough with things like that, and it just will not move. So once again, it's really just an example of things that people will get up to in order to rebuild an engine, which is obviously what must have been going on in someone's mind here, because inside the crankcases is actually pretty clean and there's evidence of new sealant around the joint faces. So someone must have put this thing together intending for it to be run like that. So it would have probably chewed itself up in no time at all. And well, it's up to me to try and figure out what to do with what we got here now. And Millie looks really worried, so I think it's over to me. Well, here I am back with that crankshaft from the very early 350 Model G2 Bullet engine, which must date from either the very late 1940s or perhaps 1950 at the latest. I've already made a video explaining the issues with the conrod that I found on it, and it was running badly out of true as well. It's obviously been knocked about and butchered quite a bit in its life, this one. Since the last video I've now changed the conrod. This is the one that I removed, which is from a later type which someone had ground down to make it narrower to fit in there. So we've got that one out. I found that the crank pin and the big end floating bush were very good, and the eye in this conrod, which was, it's a used one that I had around the place, the eye of the conrod was in very good condition and is a good fit with the floating bush and the crank pin. So I cleaned the conrod up and I've reassembled and trued this crank with the correct type of conrod on it now. So let's give it a spin and see what we've got. Well, we've got run out there of maybe 2.5 thousandths of an inch on that clock, and this one we've probably got the same, maybe 3/1000th of an inch. We've got to convert that because that's metric, so we're on the 0.1 of a millimetre is 4/1000ths of an inch. It's not moving that far, and we've got both needles on both gauges rising and falling together, and I think with one cancelling the other one out, we've got virtually no run out at all to speak of on that, in terms of what the shafts will be doing when they're installed in the main bearings. The flywheels aren't wandering up and down against each other or with each other. The gap in between them isn't opening and closing. So I think that's a very dramatic improvement over what it looked like last time I had it between the centres in the lathe before I split it and did the work on it. So that's certainly good to go. So we can move on, and just all I've got to do is put the grub screw in there. The crank pin nut is done up tightly now. Get the grub screw in, the locking screw, and that crank can be put to one side ready to go in the engine when I'm ready to rebuild it. That's looking pretty good, that one.